The grace and peace of Christ be with all of us today. Over the last week, the news has brought us images of more protests and violence in Hong Kong. We've watched fires burning through the campus of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. We've watched as students set up roadblocks and shut down streets and traffic. We watched as police beat and shot protesters, with even horrifying video coming out in the last few days of police violently attacking and beating a pregnant woman. We watch as our friends in Hong Kong sink into even deeper and darker chaos and violence, and we wonder, how much longer can this go on? Over the last few days in Australia, we've watched as the country literally burns. Hundreds of bushfires are raging across the eastern states, swallowing up huge stretches of land, burning down forests, killing animals, destroying homes, and taking human lives with them. People watch as everything they have and everything they've known goes up in flames. People watch as their lives, as their homes, as their country is destroyed, and as the fires burn, there's not even enough water to put them out. And they watch all of this and they wonder, can there be any future after this? Every day, images from all around the world pour in on top of us. Images of oppression and suffering, images of terrorism and war and violence, pictures of fires and floods and natural disasters, of so many people and so many societies at the edge of death and even beyond. And we wonder to ourselves too, how much longer can the world go on like this? Is this the end? Is this the end of society, the end of peace, even the end of the world as we know it? I think it's only natural to feel this way. When disaster floods into our life, when our plans or our dreams fail, when things go terribly wrong, we feel like our life is now over. When our relationships break down, when our plans at school or work fail, when work and life and society seem to be falling apart around us, we just can't imagine how life could possibly keep on going after this. We bury our hopes and dreams, and we give up on anything that's to come. We go through this worst of all when someone we deeply love passes away. I think it's at those times that sudden emptiness in our lives makes us question how life could possibly keep on going after such a loss. When we're faced with incredible suffering or when we go through times of terrible loss, it really feels like not just the story of our lives is coming to an end, but like the story of the whole world must somehow be ending. Because how can reality keep on going after such disasters? How dare the world keep on going unchanged? That's a feeling that the English poet W.H. Auden sums up so well in his famous funeral poem, Stop All the Clocks, when he writes, "The stars are not wanted now, put out every one. Pack up the moon and dismantle the sun, pour away the ocean and sweep up the wood, for nothing now can ever come to any good." With that great loss, with that great personal loss, it feels like the time has finally come to pack up this world and just be done with everything. I think it's this feeling of total despair, this feeling of fear and hopelessness for our lives, this feeling of fear for the whole world, for the future. It's that feeling that stands at the center of today's Bible text. But Jesus guides the disciples and us too. He guides us through that, and he helps us overcome it. Luke describes how the disciples were walking with Jesus through the temple courtyards in Jerusalem. And we shouldn't forget that they were country folk. They were country folk suddenly turning up like tourists in the big city in Jerusalem, wide-eyed and astounded by the wonders that they see in the incredible temple. But right in this very moment of their excitement, right in this moment of their awe, Jesus shocks them with the words of truth. The time is coming, Jesus says in verse 6, when all the temple will be completely demolished. Not one stone will be left on top of another. I think it's hard for us to imagine how it must have felt to hear those words. It's hard for us to imagine how shocking those words would have been for Jesus' followers and for the ancient Israelites in general. The temple was a massive structure, a historic building, a huge complex built with giant stones, each of them measuring meters across. The temple was covered in marble and gold and decorated with all kinds of gifts and tributes, not just from wealthy people, wealthy believers in Israel, but from foreign kings all around the Middle East. It was the building that symbolized Jerusalem. It was the building that symbolized their nation. For it to be destroyed would be like losing Taipei 101. It would be a sign that the whole city was in deep trouble. It would be a sign that the whole city and the whole nation had fallen into some kind of disaster. But the temple was much more than just a grand building. The ancient Israelites believed that it was also the literal house of God, that the presence of God and His glory truly lived there in the temple, within the Holy of Holies, hovering above the Ark of the Covenant. For them, the temple marked the place of God's presence with His people and with all the people of the whole world. As God's home on earth, the temple was seen as the center of the world, the place from where all other directions took their bearing. All other directions, north, south, east and west, had meaning because they were oriented to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the center to which all the people of the world would one day come to worship in this temple and to worship the God of Israel. So picturing the utter and total destruction of the temple was not just to face the violent end of Jerusalem as a city. It wasn't just something incredibly unpatriotic to say, to imagine the destruction of the nation. It also meant imagining the end of religion as the people knew it. The end of the temple meant the end of God's home. It meant the destruction of all humanity's relationship with God. It meant the end of God's presence here on earth. And how could the world possibly go on after that? That destruction of the temple, that would surely be a sign of the end of the world. That would surely be a sign that all things were now coming to an end. In Luke's passage, Jesus is talking here about a political reality. Jesus is talking here, he's warning the disciples about the temple's destruction in the coming war with Rome. And as we know from history, in the year 70, the Roman Empire's army did march on Jerusalem and destroyed the temple and the whole city with it. But while Jesus is talking here with his disciples about historical realities, about political realities, the discussion very quickly becomes apocalyptic, because the disciples just can't imagine there being any difference at all between the end of the temple and the end of the whole world. After all, how can they imagine life going on after that? How could the world go on without the temple? But Jesus tries to guide them past this. We shouldn't be too harsh on the disciples, because all through history, this is a mistake that many believers have made. In every century, in every generation, misguided people have watched historical and political disasters unfold in our world, and then they've stood in churches or out in society, even on street corners, and have proclaimed that the end of the world is coming. They looked at the state of the world around them. They looked at the political turmoil that infected their times. They looked at the natural disasters that led to incredible suffering. And as they watched the decay and collapse of their societies, they just couldn't imagine that life could keep going on after that. And so they drew up their apocalyptic charts, they filled church halls with their lectures, and they told anyone that would listen that God was now putting an end to the world. And all of them were wrong. All of them were wrong. In today's reading, Jesus warns us directly not to believe any of them. Don't let anyone mislead you, Jesus tells his followers in verse 8. For many will come in my name, saying, the time has come. But don't believe them. The story of our lives and the story of our world are both going to be filled with terrible events. Those stories of our lives, the story of our nations, the story of our world, they're going to be filled with events that fill us with fear and with despair. As Jesus says, nations will go to war against nation. The kingdoms will go to war against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes. There will be famines. There will be plagues in many lands. And there will be terrifying things. In our broken world, wars and disease and natural disasters are going to be part of our story. They're going to be part of our history. Failure and disappointment are constantly going to touch our personal lives too. And these experiences, they're always going to shock us. They're always going to horrify us. They're always going to tempt us then to give up hope in our own lives and to give up hope in our world too. But in the middle of all of that fear and worry, Jesus comes to us and quietly he comforts us and says to us, like in verse 9, don't panic. Don't panic, because this is not the end. No matter how terrifying the news may be, no matter how heartbreaking our personal losses may be, don't panic, because this is not yet the end. And that's the wonderful news that he tries to share with us. And there are two important points that I want to draw out here, that I want us to note here. First, it's important that we listen to Jesus here. It's really important that we listen to him and not allow ourselves to be fooled, either by ourselves or by others. Sadly, our world will always be full of those who encourage us to give up. We'll always face that temptation. There will always be people who want to convince us that there's no hope left, that our story with God has come to an end. There will always be people who feel like things are so bad that this must now be the end, that there will be no more future. And sometimes those people are ourselves. We convince ourselves of that. But Christ's message for us is that even in the darkest and most painful times of life, with God there is always still a way forward. There is no situation so bad that it can't be transformed by God's touch. There is no future so hopeless that it forces even God to throw up his hands in despair and just give up. And I think it's really important for us to learn that, to realize that. Because that attitude that tempts us to see a dark moment as the end of all things, that's an attitude that sinfully thinks that things are so bad that not even God can save us anymore. It's an attitude that gives up hope in God. It's an attitude that gives up hope in God's power and God's love to keep on leading us forward. But our God is not that small. Our God's power, his power of goodness and love, is not that easily defeated. Jesus' good news for us is that we can never reach that point. The tragedies we face in our lives, they are very real. The tragedies and the disasters we face in our world are very painful and very serious. The destruction of Jerusalem really was a time of horror. But that doesn't mean that the story ends there. Disasters in our own lives or in the world around us are never greater than God's power to overcome and transform them. Otherwise, they would be greater than God. And that's the mistake Christ never wants us to make. That's what Christ never wants us to think. Christ never wants us to see our problems as beyond hope, as being beyond change. It's precisely those believers who preach the end of the world who are those who have stopped believing in God's power to overcome evil, stopped believing in God's power to create new life and new possibilities. So Jesus turns to us and says, yes, disasters will come. Yes, we'll be touched by tragedy. But even then, don't panic. Don't be afraid. Because this is still not the end. In our world today, nations are going to war. Countries are using their power to abuse and hurt others, to bomb and oppress and kill. There are wars and insurrections in every part of the globe. And I'm sure the people of Iraq or Syria or Bolivia or Hong Kong look on in despair and wonder, can there be anything that comes after this? But to them, Jesus quietly comes and promises again, this is not the end. There is still hope to come. And in our world today, there are still great earthquakes. There are still great famines and plagues, bushfires and floods and typhoons. And in the aftermath, victims also cry out and wonder in despair. Can there be anything after this? And Jesus says again, don't panic. This is not the end. And the same is true in our personal lives too. How many of us sit at home broken, lonely, in despair about the state of our relationships? Our marriages have fallen apart, love has failed us. Our relationships only bring us pain. And we wonder, how can my life go on after this? How many of us have gotten back school reports or our final results back at university and seen only blackness and hopelessness ahead? And we wonder, how can my life go on after this? We watch our business plans fall apart. We watch our hopes for the future come to nothing, and we give up all hope. We tell ourselves that our lives are over. And in hospitals all around our city, when our medical tests come back bad, when we're faced with that frightening diagnosis, or when we sit in tears as our loved ones quietly pass away, again we think to ourselves, how can life go on after this? How can life go on? How can there be anything after this? We think to ourselves, that's it. Pack up the moon and dismantle the sun, because there can be no more life or hope after this. But again, this is where Jesus comes and says, no. This is where Jesus comes and says to us again, don't let go, don't give up, because this is still not the end. Don't give in to despair, because the power of Christ's love reaches beyond that all. Nothing can stop the transforming power of Christ's love. Not political turmoil, not social conflict, not our personal failures, nor even death itself. None of these disasters can defeat Christ or represent a limit on his loving power. With Christ, there is always still more love to come. There is still more hope to come. And our story is not yet over. But having said that, after giving us this wonderful news, Jesus also reminds his followers that it comes with a warning, or maybe better said, with an expectation. Yes, even in the darkest of times, we have Christ's promise that he won't give up on us, that this won't be the end of our story. But that wonderful hope must never become an excuse for us to then just sit back and do nothing. Christ's promise of hope is not an excuse for us to be complacent. It's not an excuse for us to look at the disasters going on in our world or in our lives and then just shrug our shoulders, sit back and do nothing. Not giving up on the future also means not giving up on the present. And as Jesus reminded his followers, before they would reach their promised future, they were going to have to face some challenges in the present first. As ancient Israel society fell apart, as different religious factions and political groups fought against each other and pushed their nation to destruction, Christ's followers would have to bravely hold on to their faith in the middle of that. Friends and family would turn on them, Jesus tells them. They would be rejected, arrested, put on trial. even be killed. And in all of that, there would be an active role for them to play. As the nation fell apart around them, Christ's followers would be called on to keep representing the goodness and the gospel of Christ. And in a world of growing hatred, chaos, and violence, they are called to keep speaking those words of wisdom and truth, even if that comes with serious consequences. I think the same is true for us still today. As our world faces ever more serious challenges, as our nations, communities, as our Earth's climate, as our personal relationships crack and break, our task as Christ's followers is not just to sit back and do nothing, trusting that everything will work out fine. Christ's command to us is don't panic. His command is don't act. Christ says to us, don't panic. He doesn't say, don't act. Instead, Christ calls us to be active as his followers, actively standing up for his gospel, actively giving the world a testimony to the good news of Christ's demand for goodness, his demand for fairness and love, actively witnessing to the whole world that the solution is not to give up hope, not to give up hope in the world or hope in the future, but to work now in the present, to cooperate with Christ in transforming this world, in shaping it for the better. And when things go wrong in our personal lives, that same thing is true. Our task is not to take Christ's promise of hope as a reason to just keep destroying ourselves, to stay trapped in our bad habits, to push on with our addictions and our self-abuse. After all, the promise of the resurrection is not just a get-out-of-hospital-free card. The promise of the resurrection is not an invitation to carelessly keep on destroying our bodies now. In the same way, Christ's promise of unending hope for the world is not an invitation for us to keep our injustices going. It's not an invitation for us to keep on destroying the earth or to keep pushing hard towards that edge of death and just waiting for God to pick up the pieces afterwards. As Christ's disciples, our task is not to sit back and give up. Our task isn't to fall into hopelessness or despair. Our task is to bravely rise up to that challenge and to work with God on making a change in our lives and a change in our world. As Christ's followers walked through Jerusalem, they couldn't imagine their future without the temple. They couldn't imagine their city or even the world existing without the temple. And yet what Jesus shows them is that the temple's not eternal. The temple's not an eternal part of who they are. It would soon be gone, but their story will still go on. Change is frightening. Failure and disappointment are frightening. But when that comes, that doesn't mean we've reached the end of our story. Instead, they open up a way for new beginnings, new opportunities, set on a greater foundation. The temple wasn't eternal, and none of the things that we see around us today are eternal either. But what is eternal and never changing is God's love for us. His loving power is never ending and never failing. That's why Christ alone can give us the promise that he does, the promise of eternal hope. Maybe the nation and the world around us are changing. Maybe we feel like the hopes and plans that we had for our lives are failing and falling apart until not a stone of our lives is left standing on top of another. Holding bad news and disappointment in our hands, we look at the future and we worry. We look at the future and we find it hard to imagine that anything good could be there waiting for us in front of us. But it's in those frightening times that Christ comes to us over and over again, and he quietly encourages us and says to us, don't panic, don't give up, because this is not yet your end. There is still so much more goodness to come. Let's pray together. Our Lord Christ, change in our world frightens us. Change in our lives frightens us. We wonder whether there can be anything good to look forward to tomorrow. In times of worry, help us to trust in your loving promise that there is still more goodness and more hope to come, that this is not our end. Help us not to give up on life or on this world, but to bravely live with hope and to bravely keep acting as your disciples in this world, pushing forward for what is right and good and true. We pray in your holy name. Amen.